This is WCCX 104.5 FM hosting D&D with B&D, saying a lot to nobody. So, this is a talk show related to Dungeons & Dragons and also role-playing board games in general. And we are getting a call right now. Hello there? Hello there?
It's not working.
All right.
Sorry for the technical
difficulties. So this show, nobody is going to be listening to. The one person who was listening once they heard about Dungeons and Dragons just signed off.
Goodbye.
But we will start. Yep, that's the person. But we will start by introducing ourselves. My name is Drew Sherrod. I am in my fourth year at Carroll University, where we are broadcasting from. I am a religious studies major with a theater minor. And my co-host here today is...
I'm Brad Weller. I am a sophomore second year at Carroll University. I have a double major in theater and music with a minor in arts management, so a lot of performing arts, and yeah.
Yeah, so I'm studying to be a pastor, and Brad's...
I'm doing stuff.
Doing whatever he wants to, pretty much. So our show is kind of explaining Dungeons & Dragons for both people who are already invested in Dungeons & Dragons and also people who have not yet gotten into Dungeons & Dragons. It's an expanding field for people right now, so we're hoping to bring in new players and people, but first let's explain a little bit about ourselves and our experiences with D&D. So D&D stands for Dungeons & Dragons, and it's a game of imagination, essentially, where one person makes up a story called the Dungeon Master or Game Master in some other board or role-playing board games. They make up a story, and other players play in that story and kind of just react to what the DM is saying. And we'll explain a little bit more about that in a little bit. But my experiences with DM, I have been a Dungeon Master for about 3 years now, maybe a little less than that. I started doing D&D. I started doing D&D with my dad a long time ago because he grew up in a time when D&D started, before the Satanic Panic, which we'll talk about today as well, because I'm a religious studies major, so I need to talk about how religion and D&D have interplayed at one point during this. So he played early D&D. Dungeons & Dragons and most role-playing games have gone through many iterations and changes of rules over time. He played what is commonly known today as second edition Dungeons & Dragons. Back then, everything was a little more complex, but also simplified in that players could play more than one character at a time. Which all of this, by the way, will be explained more as we go on.
But nowadays, D&D is much more simplified.
At the time, the reason that he first talked about Dungeons & Dragons to us is because we were at some library outside a window, and I saw one of the books for Dungeons & Dragons, which was a monster manual book, and the cover of it was the fourth edition, so 2 editions later from what my dad was doing, fourth edition book for the monster manual, which is a textbook for all the monsters you can put into Dungeons & Dragons. But I got interested in, was like, what is that crazy monster? Because, I was really into, nature and, monsters and mythology and stuff like that as a kid. And dinosaurs. I wanted to be a paleontologist back at that time. Thank you, Brad, for sharing my inner childhood dreams.
No problem.
Yeah, so I was really interested in that, but at the time, 3.5 books, the third edition of Dungeons & Dragons, was the kind of books you could get. And so Dad wanted us to get into Dungeons & Dragons, but didn't want to just show us the old books, so he gave me the new books, the third edition books, and that's what I got invested into, was third edition Dungeons & Dragons. D&D goes up to 5th edition now. I played with Dad for a while in the old editions, and we played up until I was maybe 11 years old, and we got to a place in the world that he created called Bone Hill, which was essentially a dungeon full of skeletons and zombies and stuff. And we kind of stopped. We were each playing, me and my brother were the only players in that game. We both played 3 characters each. And I'll still always remember those characters' names. I still reference them in my own game that I do. But that was really my only player experience of D&D for a long time. I mostly am a dungeon master, which is the other side of the coin for D&D, is there's the dungeon master and there's the players, and that's essentially the only 2 kind of people who are active in D&D. And I've been a dungeon master for 3 years, where I created my own world, and have been DMing for a number of people that I love and hold very dear to myself. One of those people being my co-host here today. And Brad, you want to talk about how you came into D&D through my game?
So, the first time I played D was 2 years ago? Over 2 years? 2.5.
2.25 years ago.
Something like
Technically,
that.
you played a game before that.
I played a couple, like, really derpy games of trying to introduce me to D&D. They were all interesting. I died in most of them. It's fun. I love telling stories. I've always did as a child. Active imagination. That's what happens when you have no friends. It's great times.
Fair.
But also being like a crazy music and theater person, I always loved performing and telling stories. And one thing I love about D&D is it's a combination of being an audience and an actor. So you get the best of both worlds in telling a fantasy story.
So like we said before, Brad here is a theater major and I am a theater minor. We met each other through drama club in our high school. So D&D takes a lot of acting qualities into account when playing. It can be more fun if you have acting experience. That is. That's what drew us into the game. A lot of what drew me into the game, at least. But we're going to talk about the different kinds of people who come into D&D, and we hope that by the end of this we can explain why D&D is a good game for pretty much anyone and everyone in the world. I honestly believe that Dungeons & Dragons, or role-playing games in general, because of their malleability and because of their freedom, they can be something that can be played by pretty much anyone, no matter where you come from or what your experiences are. But we'll explain that in a little bit. First of all, Brad, what is D&D?
So I like calling D&D an interactive storytelling, fantasy storytelling, where a group of friends just tell a story together. It's divided between 2 groups of people. The DM, which stands like most of the difficulties and encounters that the players or player characters will have to deal with, mostly through a cooperative means, though there is occasional backstabbing to make a story better.
So I'm sure you remember as a kid, probably, playing games and making up stuff for your friends, and sometimes there was the one kid who tried to take over the story and stuff, but essentially it was a fun time as a kid.
Of course, as a kid I played Imagination with my next door neighbor nearly daily.
So Dungeons & Dragons is pretty much just that, but for adults and anyone, and also with a little bit of math. Not complex math.
Not at all.
Not complex math, but a little bit of math. It can be a lot more complicated than that, or it can be that simple. I'll talk about it later, but I have played Dungeons and Dragons with 5-year-olds and been able to pull it off. I work at a daycare, which I will not say the name of here, but I played 3 games with 5 to 11-year-olds, and all of them went very well. And I'll talk about that a little bit later, and how it's applicable for everyone. But I want to explain a little bit more about D&D. So a lot of people also, there are quite a number of people who have played video games, right? And there are a lot of video games that take their roots from Dungeons and Dragons, actually. A lot of people have played things like Skyrim, Fallout. I'm just going to name Bethesda games only, apparently. Witcher 3, well, any of the Witchers. I don't know why I said just Witcher 3. But there are plenty of role-playing games out there. Some of them mythology-based, some of them not. Hold on just a second. Okay, there we go. My computer seemed to die for a second, and I was freaking out. By the way, we have no idea what we're doing here, so this is our first radio show, and we're terrified. So anyway, but a lot of those games people are really like enthused about because they think that they can essentially do anything in that game, but that's never going to be true for video games, or at least not for a very long time, because there's always going to be arbitrary limits to video games. In fact, one thing that is always going to be true of video games is you can't have truly random encounters in video games, which so a video game will always have limits. You'll always have world borders. You'll always only be able to go so far as the programming of the game accounts for.
You can only do so many things. The physics can only go so far. The creativity and like canon can only meld so much.
Yeah. So one thing that D&D is that it is like one of those video games, except you truly are free. Well, for the most part, you truly are free because your DM, the person who's making this world and talking to you and explaining this world around you, is not a computer. They can calculate all of those things, perhaps better if they're a good DM. Some DMs will give you arbitrary limits that they probably shouldn't. But if you have a good DM, they can calculate those things and make up stuff on the fly that are quote-unquote random. So you can literally do anything you want in D&D. I remember one time early in my D&D experience when I was playing with Dad, I literally, instead of taking a combat situation in the middle of battling goblins, I literally, instead of attacking or casting a spell or doing anything else that you would expect a player to do, I decided to try and offend the goblins by having my character turn around and pull down his pants. And you can do that. The DM allows you to do that. Usually, it probably won't work out well for you, but you can do it. And one of the things to put out there is there are limits in terms of... There are limits as in... There are limits as if the game were a real-world situation. You're not always going to be the best at everything you do. You can't just say, I'm going to throw this basketball and get it in the hoop on the first try. So what how D&D accounts for that is you have dice in the game, which whenever you want to do something that has a chance of failure, you roll the dice to see if that thing works. And different characters have different bonuses to different things depending on how you built the character.
But,
now, yes, Brad?
Just one thing on D&D is the randomness makes D&D what it is, simply. It makes it equatable to life. It makes things like have a failure rate or a success rate, and even the DM can't decide what happens.
Oh, yeah, like... Failing in D&D is one of the most fun times you can have in D&D.
Oh, 100%.
I mean, that's true of video games sometimes, but more often you're trying to get a win in a video game. And you're trying to get a win in D&D too, but a lot of the fun encounters and stuff happen when players fail to do something and life happens in the game.
Yeah.
And something that is really nice about D&D is... At least for Brad and me have never played D&D with random people. You can certainly go and play D&D with a bunch of random people in a game shop or whatever, but Brad and me have always played for friends. And so part of what's so interesting about the game is you can tailor-make the game for your audience. And that's something that is really important about the game. that I'll get to. That the one complicated factor is the DM, which we'll get to that later. But we can make situations that relate to real life. For our characters. I know I did a game once that I won't go into too much detail for, but it was a Thanksgiving game, and it was all about us as players, and we actually played ourselves in the game. And we were just it was a way to kind of say to my friends, the people I love that I made this game for, what they meant to me in a by making a horrible, horror-induced nightmare game for them in real life. So there are two parts of a D&D game, and that's the players and the dungeon master. Now, a lot of people think that the dungeon master creates everything in a game, which is not necessarily true. I know as a player, I feel like I'm not letting you talk that much.
It's all right. You have more experience in this. I'll chime in when I need to.
No, please chime in whenever, Bradley. I know I, as a player, for instance, always try to describe what I'm doing for myself instead of having the DM describe everything. For D&D, usually what you do for the game is you create the characters you want to play. And you play those characters, and they can be completely different from who you are, just like you did as a child, making up characters who were spies or
pirates.
Sure, pirates. I always played a game with my brother that was a spy game because we were really into Spy Kids as kids, it was really ridiculous. We had episodes and stuff, and some of the episodes lasted 2 minutes, and others lasted hours and hours. But yeah. So you create the characters, you create a name, and you create a class and a race. Sometimes, though, there are many role-playing games where you don't have to create any of that stuff. You can just create a name and basically make up how your character got to the point they are in life, and just play from there. D&D is only Dungeons and Dragons is only one example of role-playing games, and we'll touch on a couple of them as we go on in our series. For instance, there are Call of Cthulhu, Pathfinder. Pathfinder is very similar to Dungeons and Dragons, a little bit different.
Mutants and Masterminds.
Star Wars.
There's
Star Wars. There's a Doctor Who role-playing game.
There are so many different role-playing
games.
There's
Dread, which isn't a classic role-playing game because you don't have an actual company that created it. You just have people who made up this role-playing game, and all you need is a Jenga tower, and I'm going to talk about that a little later. Because that's how you play with kids.
So there are so many different kinds of role-playing games. Drew and I mainly play Dungeons and Dragons, so that's why we're basing this radio show, because we love the game so much. And also there are different editions/versions of Dungeons and Dragons, which go into more detail and less detail, and that's how Drew and I kind of differentiate ourselves.
And
that makes sense?
Indeed. Yeah. Brad is more of a 5th edition, the newest kind of Dungeons and Dragons. He likes 5th editions of all Dungeons and Dragons games. And you've done a little bit of dungeon mastering yourself for that edition. You're not doing any currently anymore, correct?
It's iffy.
It's iffy. You'll find another one.
Oh, yeah.
I do 3.5, which was
it's much more
debated the most popular Dungeons and Dragons edition.
Yeah, we'll touch more upon the editions later.
But the reason I talk about different role-playing games is because I know that a lot of people see Dungeons and Dragons and see all of the combat involved and see that as a turn-off from Dungeons and Dragons. But not only in D&D, but also there are a number of role-playing games out there that do not focus on combat, and which I really like, because I'm not the most stellar fan of combat. I usually make my Dungeons & Dragons games have one combat scenario a game, if even that. Sometimes there are multiple games in a row where there's no combat. Combat is a really tricky subject in RPGs, something that we will discuss in the future because it is hard to describe combat scenarios. That's one of the reasons why it's complicated. When you have a video game in front of you, you can see everything happening in front of you. But when you have 16 players who are lined up for their turn and you're going to wait for your turn for 16, 5-minute battle steps, it becomes a bit of a slog for some people. But we'll talk about battle in the future. In fact, we'll talk about what our schedule is going to be right now, real quick, for our upcoming shows. We have sort of a pseudo-schedule here. Pseudo-schedule that may change as we decide on Wednesday night that we have too much
going on, show
class stuff going on and can't do it because it's 10 o'clock at night. The only reason, by the way, we're doing 10 o'clock shows is so that when I inevitably swear, I won't get yelled at. I'm not saying that this is going to be a constantly swearing podcast, but it's going to happen at some point. But today we're just talking in general about what D&D is and how it affects our lives and how it can affect other people's lives in general. Next, for the rest of our saga, we've kind of divided into two segments. Our first half is more geared towards new players coming in and wanting to create their first character for Dungeons & Dragons. I said Ed will talk about other role-playing games a little bit on this show. It is mostly geared towards Dungeons & Dragons and Pathfinder, because Pathfinder is basically the same thing as Dungeons & Dragons, but it is mostly Dungeons & Dragons shows. Yeah. Oh, the second half of our shows will be more based on aspects of dungeon mastering, which is the more, I would argue, the more complex half of the relationship.
Drew, are you talking this school semester?
Yeah, this school semester.
Yeah, so we're going to have 10 episodes that are more introductory to D&D, and then...
Brad, please, look at the schedule. It's 6, not 10.
It's 6? I thought it was more 12.
Oh, it's 12 for the first semester, but that's split between 6 of them being about becoming a player, and then the second half is DMing stuff.
All right.
So, for instance, this show is about Dungeons and Dragons in general. Our next show will be talking about the ability scores of player characters, which is essentially your different. How would you describe it?
It's what you're good at and what you're not good at.
What you're good at and what you're not good at. Yeah, strength versus intelligence. And we'll describe more of that when we get to it and help you start looking at those things and building characters and stuff. Our third show, we'll be talking about classes. We'll be looking at both 3.5 and 5e mostly. 5e and 3.5 mostly have the same classes, with the exception of 5e adding the Warlock class, and also 2 classes that are still kind of being in beta, I guess. Yeah, sure. It's so weird to think of Dungeons & Dragons having an in beta sort of thing. It never had that in previous editions, I don't think. It's a fairly new thing. But yeah. And then fourth show, we'll be talking about races. So that's elves, dwarves, humans, the things you might see in Lord of the Rings or other fantasy world settings. We'll be talking about the traditional races for 5e and 3.5, though you might be in a Dungeons & Dragons game where someone's created a totally different world that has totally different races and classes, i.e. myself. And then the fifth show will go through the actual part of creating your character from the ground up and talk about those ability scores, classes, races, and then also teasing a little bit about alignment, which is how you lean morally as a character. Are you evil, good? Are you more leaning towards the law or free-willed? That sort of thing. And we'll also talk about feats, which are just additional little abilities you get which are kind of complicated to explain. Starting with the 6th show, we'll start talking about things that more avid D&D players will find helpful to them if they want to start being a dungeon master and stuff. We'll talk about storytelling and the aspects of storytelling for D&D, which is and is not different from writing a story. From having experience of writing my own book once upon a time, it's the same and it's not.
Yeah, and
there's a lot. It's comparatively different. Like writing a TV show, writing a video game, writing a book are 3 completely different subtypes of writing, and writing for D&D as a DM is very much the same sort of thing. It's very different from writing any other sort of media. Yeah.
Also, it's similar, and
it's similar in some ways, but yeah.
And I also personally dabble in playwriting and composition and songwriting.
Yeah,
so
there's all sorts of different kinds of writing. We could talk about that for a whole different set of podcasts, or radio shows, or whatever we're calling
whatever you
this.
want to call this.
Oh, by the way, you had an episode name for this episode, didn't you? Yeah. Okay. On our then 7th show, we'll be talking about the different editions of Dungeons & Dragons, which you've heard me mention a couple of times. And that's more of a complex issue of Dungeons & Dragons that I feel like I've been confusing the audience so far. The audience of nobody who is listening so far are with talking about, but we'll get into those and the differences between them and why 3.5 is better than 5e.
Or why 5e is a superior.
No, yeah. So anyway, 8th show, we mentioned a little bit about how combat is complicated. And 8th show, we'll be talking all about combat and how you can make your combat as a dungeon master feel right and feel good.
Or streamlined.
Which is really difficult.
It is harder than you think.
Yeah. 9th show, I guess we have written down here that we're talking about spells. I don't know how we're talking about spells and magic for an hour, but okay.
Yeah.
I guess. Yeah, we have. There's stuff to talk about that. Talk about with that. Yeah.
Who needs a sword?
Spells are complicated in Dungeons & Dragons. They're one of the most complicated parts in base D&D to me. Like 3.5, I simplified for my game what spellcasting is majorly from 3.5 spellcasting stuff. And 5e is also complicated compared to mine. It's ridiculous. Spellcasting is unnecessarily complicated in Dungeons & Dragons, in my opinion. Just pick spells, and those are the spells you have for the day. It doesn't have to be spells known versus prepared spells. Anyway, it's complicated. We're confusing the people who don't understand any of this stuff, but that's okay. This is for all audiences. The all audience is of nobody who's listening.
Thank you, nobody.
10th show, we are going to talk about monsters in general, which is a huge topic. We could definitely talk about that for an hour. I assume we're only going to touch on classical monsters because that is definitely all you need for an hour. Now, and then our 11th and 12th shows are going to round out with the name of the game. Our 11th show, we are going to talk about dungeons, something that I actually don't have that much experience with because I usually have open combat in like the wilds and stuff and don't really make a lot of dungeons. I made a huge trap dungeon, but not really a explore at your own leisure dungeon for our game.
I made a couple dungeons and I have fun with that.
Yeah, but dungeons are hard to make.
They are.
Not linearly, but also you need to get to this point at some point. Yeah. And then to round out with the last show for this season, we will be talking about the dragons of the Dungeons and Dragons world and the different types and how they are better than any dragons in pretty much any other media.
Oh, they're beautiful.
They're amazing.
Beautiful.
Like people talk about Dungeons and Dragons and like think of like the game Skyrim and how pretty pitiful the dragons in our Skyrim are, but the dragons in the Dungeons and Dragons world, or at least the copy and paste Dungeons and Dragons world, are pretty much gods.
They are.
They will destroy everything in their path. So there are a lot of ways to handle dragons as well, which we will be talking about. I handle dragons in a way that I'm sure most dungeon masters would despise, in that they are everywhere in my world.
Whereas yes, they are.
Most dungeon masters would be like, they should be scarcities, they should be hard to find, and like foreign legends. No, the trick to doing that is you always make it clear that there's always going to be a dragon that's bigger and more badass than the previous dragons you fought. All right, so that's basically our schedule right now. We're still learning.
Yes.
All right, so Dungeons and Dragons was created a long time ago by Gary Gygax and Dave Arneson, and it was based mostly upon their experiences in watching Lord of the Rings, which is one of my favorite series to watch. Bradley has not seen the entire thing.
Sadly.
No, that is a shame that we need to fix right after this show is done. Just kidding. You need to go. But they watched Lord of the Rings, why am I saying watch Lord of the Rings? They read Lord of the Rings. That was when the books were very popular at the time. It was long before the movies were out. And they also played a lot of a game called Chainmail, and played a lot of wargaming. And what wargaming back then was essentially you controlled military units and you had them battle each other.
Yeah, it was like tactics.
And what they thought about in watching Lord of the Rings, God. Reading Lord of the Rings was to take a more human element and look at characters instead, and have people play individual characters in a game where someone creates the world for you to play in. And so they came up with the idea of Dungeons and Dragons. It should be noted that it wasn't necessarily the first or only role-playing game at the time. It spawned a lot of role-playing games off it and really got the train rolling on role-playing games. But it's a common misconception that it was the first role-playing game out there. Chainmail could in some ways be called a role-playing game in itself, which they got the idea from. But it was popular for a time back then, and then the Satanic Panic happened, which it was still kind of popular through that time. But towards the 90s and early 2000s, D&D was kind of on a downslope. Until recently, it's been getting kind of a rise in popularity again from a lot of different things.
Like nerd culture being more accepted, as you see with like such expensive Marvel movies coming out yearly. I
mean, even with video games, back in the day, only nerds played video games. I know jocks didn't play video games back in the day at all. I mean, not at all, but like it was a rarity at the time. But now everyone plays video games. Well, a lot of people play video games. I mean, even Call of Duty. A lot of people play Call of Duty. That's still a video game. That's still nerd culture. And there are things like Game of Thrones, which I just say for a second, I kind of despise the fact that Game of Thrones has become like, people call it you're a jock nerd for watching Game of Thrones, because a lot of jocks apparently watch Game of Thrones. But Game of Thrones is such a massively nerdy series if you actually look at the lore behind it. Like I just, it really ticks me off when people say that that we shouldn't accept the jock nerds into nerd culture because they weren't true nerds to begin with or whatever, because they started being a nerd because of Game of Thrones or something. But I think that's very valid, and I think that we should expand and nerd culture to those people, because we need to take over the universe.
And as Game of Thrones actually progressed, people got more and more accepting of it. One of our friends actually did his capstone project on this and did research, and it gained more popularity as the show progressed.
Game of Thrones? I didn't even know about that.
Yeah, like reviews of Game of Thrones.
Really?
I don't want to... Do I want to do
No, that's okay, but I didn't know about that. You'll have to tell me about that later.
Oh, yeah. Totally
but, like, I know a couple of people that think that Game of Thrones is, like, a sin against nerd culture because it's brought in a bunch of sporty people, and I think that's ridiculous. But that's a little bit of a tangent.
But nowadays, it's more easily accessible because marketing wants everyone to do it. So the more customers you have, the more people are satisfied. Therefore, they made D&D better as time progressed.
Yeah, I mean, D&D is seen in a lot of things nowadays. You see it in media, like in...
Community did a couple episodes.
Community did a couple of episodes. There was it was also a huge factor of the Stranger Things series, which you haven't watched, but I know a lot of people are super super into. It's just been becoming way more of a popular thing with like even like shows that show games of Dungeons and Dragons, like Critical Role. Why can't I think of anything else? I know other games. You're only thinking of ones from that spawned off of Matthew Mercer.
Almost. There are so many people on Twitch and YouTube.
Adventure Zone.
Doing Harmon Quest.
Harmon Quest. There was one I watched that was doing Pathfinders, one of their storylines in Giant Slayer. I can't remember the name of the show right now off the top of my head.
So many shows.
But there are so many shows online now that people watch, which I know there are some Dungeons & Dragons players I know that don't like to watch people play Dungeons & Dragons. You're not super interested in watching people play D&D. It's much more fun, admittedly, to play D&D yourself. But it is becoming more popular because of things like that and people seeing huge people playing the games. Like, for instance, Critical Role had Vin Diesel come in and play a game once. Vin Diesel plays games. Stephen Colbert is a huge Dungeons and Dragons nerd. I mean, he's a nerd in almost every right, but still, big name who plays Dungeons and Dragons. What is that? Who's saying stuff to us?
I'm just pointing at the time, Drew.
Oh, thank you. Thank you, Bradley. Good to know.
But so many people play and watch D&D. The one thing that's great about D&D is it's at the end of the day you're just watching characters and getting to like grow with them and watch them develop as time progresses, just like a normal TV series or a good book or a good movie.
Yeah, and like Brad and me are super into like classical Dungeons and Dragons where you play medieval fantasy sort of stuff. But Dungeons and Dragons can literally be put into any setting and you can pretend to be anything you want. You can make it a spy thriller, a horror series, a sci-fi sort of thing.
You can make it
literally, it can be made into something interesting for any person you play. If you're into mysteries, you can make it's some sort of mystery sort of thing. Though I will say you'll have to get a good DM because making mysteries in D&D is hard.
So you think no offense to the audience in some shows, how they don't catch on clues, but players with puzzles, it's a time sometimes.
Oh yeah, it's real fun.
Drew, remember
sometimes they solve it way quicker than you want them to. Sometimes they don't solve it ever. But
Drew, can I bring up 2 examples?
Yeah.
One time, someone broke a puzzle in like 5 seconds when you thought it would take an hour, and another time when you gave me a puzzle, you got so annoyed with me not completing it that you came and helped eventually.
Yeah, the dungeon master started making the puzzle fix itself because you just are infuriating.
I was trying to play a smart
it was a literal puzzle too.
It was.
It was literally just put these puzzle pieces together.
I couldn't do it
in a time limit, but
couldn't do it.
Like, the person on the computer screen was having a better time of doing it than you with your hands. Anyways, but I truly think that Dungeons & Dragons is for everyone from the age of 3 to 100. Sorry.
You just have to adapt it.
Brain farted there for a second. Now, Dungeons & Dragons can be complex and like a video game. You can put leveling up into it, and you can put bosses into it. And that is a part of the game for most players. Most D&D games you'll find traditionally do have a leveling up system, either through experience points or through milestones in the story, or with bosses. But it can be a lot more open than that, because you can go anywhere in the world you want to. Usually the DM doesn't stop you, or, well, I shouldn't say usually, but my style of DMing is to not really railroad the players and make them do a specific storyline. Now there are tricks you can do to kind of make it railroady, but also open to them. But
we keep on touching on that, like, a DM makes this game, but it's so important to the experience to have that human connection with the other people, because typically, or at least half the time, this game is played with your friends who want to enjoy the experience, so you know what they like, so you instantly make things that they enjoy, so they'll have a wonderful experience, and you can share it with them. That's what I love about it, just making a friend group closer with shared adventures, trials, tribulations.
Now, a huge part of Dungeons & Dragons, and the part that is hardest to find if you want to start a Dungeons & Dragons group, is typically the Dungeon Master. Because the Dungeon Master, a lot of times, has to take a number of hours to create a game and a world for the people to play in. Now, you can, as a Dungeon Master, there are games that are created for you through the Dungeons & Dragons
we both have used them.
Media. We both have used them. I typically don't like to use them because a lot of times they are very geared towards battle, which I've already said that I lean more towards story than battles. There are still battles in my story, but oftentimes I find that the created media for Dungeons & Dragons is a little too battle heavy, especially in the one that I played that was in Pathfinder, which Pathfinder is very battle heavy.
Very battle
very, very battle heavy. But I know that, but a Dungeon Master shouldn't necessarily feel like they have to put in as many hours as me or Brad. You can definitely put in a very little bit amount of work and get a fine product of it. You can literally create a story that you've watched somewhere that your players haven't watched and make that into a story. I know that you also don't necessarily need to read the rules necessarily either. You can make stuff up if your players are cool with that and you okay it with them ahead of time. I know that you were saying to me one time that you have actually not really read much of the Dungeon Master's Guide.
I changed that this weekend.
Yeah, you mostly just DM'd based on watching me, I guess. Which is, I don't like to say because it makes me sound like an arrogant cock, but I guess you found something in watching me and model yourself on that. So yes. I must be pretty great.
Of course.
No. I do a game every week on Saturdays, and I do another game every other week as well on Fridays. So I am usually very constantly busy in creating worlds. I still need to finish making both my worlds. I think we're going to go a little over.
I just keep on showing him the time just to make sure.
It's fine. It's cool.
No one's after us, I think.
Yeah, no one's after us. No one comes in here after 11.
Yeah,
we'll just stay in this building until the morning. No, I'm kidding. We won't stay that long.
Please, no.
But where was I? You interrupted my train of thought.
I base my DMing style off of you. You're doing 1.5 games a week. You spend a lot of time for it. I
spend a lot of time for it. I still am not done with this Saturday and Friday's game. I usually plan them the day I don't plan them the day before, but I finish them the day before because they're a lot of work. to make, and I put a lot of effort into them because they are for people that I really do care about, and that's a major part of why Brad and me play games. Is I started doing D&D because I wanted my friends from high school to stick around. I didn't want to have to say goodbye to them yet. A couple of them have left over time, and that's okay. We still talk from time to time. But a lot of them have stuck around, and I am now bringing on friends to add to the D&D group as well that will stick around for a while, I'm sure. My game is pretty continuous. It doesn't have a set end date specifically, but that is one reason in why D&D is important to me as a dungeon master. I don't have a lot of experience playing. I wish I played more D&D from a player perspective, but it is a relief when I get to sometimes because it's very fun. But I think dungeon mastering is definitely my preferred method of doing the game, because I get to create everything and kill my players in the game. Because there is an element of death in D&D most of the time. Yeah. You can die fighting the monsters and such. I feel like I'm not explaining at all what D&D is but the only reason for that is because it can literally be anything you want it to be. The only expectation really is that you make something up. And I was talking about dungeon mastering before, but technically you don't have to have a dungeon master. I have heard of games that are not quite Dungeons and Dragons but are role-playing games where people will literally make up a story together and just gather together to make up a story together, and each person adds something to the story, where there is no classic dungeon master in the game. And that's really cool to me. It's certainly not my style of playing. Oh, what's the matter, Bradley? Am I not on the air?
I was told that my mic might not be on.
Oh, is it not? Maybe you just don't talk enough.
Can you press a couple more buttons?
What do you want me to press, Bradley?
The one...
Are you on the right mic?
Testing? Okay, I'll be on this mic now. It's all good. Were you
not on the right mic this entire time?
I think we misinterpreted the mics.
Wow, you're impressive.
I am impressive.
You're also very loud right now. You're super clipping.
Okay, I'm sorry about that. I am good now.
I'll quiet you down a bit.
Okay. Sorry about not being able to hear me before.
And then screaming into the microphone.
I took the fault mic. That's fun.
My God, you're clipping this.
Calm down. We're okay. I can see my butt.
That is embarrassing. I've been scared to death this entire time, but apparently you're the one who screwed up everything.
Hey.
Jeez.
Hey.
Well, at least I've been talking for most of this and interrupting you.
And you haven't been hearing any of my whispers against Drew this entire podcast, radio show. Oh, darn.
Darn. By the way, we have another person here besides me. It's Bradley Weller.
Yes. I just got on the right mic. How many minutes in? 56 minutes
56 minutes in.
For an hour-long podcast.
Yeah. I mean, at least we did everything we were supposed to, which I was really worried about forgetting about the PSAs.
And we accidentally did both of them.
Yeah, we did both of them. So we're good now. We can do whatever we want now.
Even swear it's past 10?
Yeah,
it's very past 10. But what will we do next?
All right, so I wanted to talk about Dungeons & Dragons and how it's a benefit to society, because I've talked a little bit about the Satanic Panic a long time ago. So how the Satanic Panic happened is there was a lot more involved than just Dungeons & Dragons in the Satanic Panic. It was essentially just a scare, kind of like the Red Scare, I would compare it to, like the communist Red Scare from McCarthyism, but more involved with religion and different media's possibly influencing children to turn to Satanism and stuff. And part of that was because Satanism was actually kind of a thing at the time, though Satanism, as we know it, is not what Satanism actually is.
What?
No, it's not. It's very different. It's atheistic, but it's not actually worshiping Satan. Mind blown, right? Yeah. No, very few people actually worship Satan. Is that surprising? Really? Who needs to be told this? As a religious studies major, I find these sort of things particularly interesting. But what I was saying is a lot of medias were being accused of kind of enforcing that rhetoric. One of those things was hard rock music. A lot of bands were accused of being involved in this satanic fever that was going on, supposedly. And then Dungeons & Dragons was also at the time. And it makes sense in a way. Mm-hmm. Dungeons & Dragons is a fantasy world with magic in it. Ooh, crazy.
Yeah, and my person has ties to like Cthulhu and got possessed by a daemon.
Yeah, no one knows who Cthulhu is. Some of the people listening probably don't know who Cthulhu is, but it's essentially an evil god. And there are evil gods in a lot of Dungeons & Dragons world, as well as there are multiple gods in the Dungeons & Dragons world, which you
more than one god?
Yeah, more than one god. So obviously a prime target of conservative Christianity and other religions as well, honestly. Mm-hmm. So there was a huge satanic panic revolving around Dungeons & Dragons, hard rock bands, some other medias as well, just violence in media in general as well. Well, I lost my train of thought. 1 second. Sorry. There was also part of the reason for that is because there were a lot of stories linked to Dungeons & Dragons about possible suicides. And how that happened is there was one kid who committed suicide in a sewer system, and he happened to play Dungeons & Dragons at the time. And his mother attached this interest to Dungeons & Dragons, which was really only, from what we can tell nowadays and from what we can tell about the kid, from friends and stuff, was not a huge part of his life. He did it as a hobby on the side, but it wasn't a huge part of his life. But it got connected to his suicide, essentially. And from that spawned a number of other stories about kids supposedly committing suicide because of Dungeons & Dragons, none of which were true. The only suicide that actually happened was that first kid, and there's no connection whatsoever to that being because of Dungeons & Dragons.
Correlation does not mean causation.
Yeah, so that happened, and it killed Dungeons & Dragons for a while. Today, with the rise of Dungeons & Dragons, I think that Dungeons & Dragons is a huge influence in helping a lot of people these days. I'm going to pause for a second because I just want to repeat at the 1 hour mark that this is WCCX Waukesha 104.5 FM, talking about Dungeons & Dragons with Bradley Weller and Drew Sherrod.
D&D with B&D.
D&D with B&D, saying a lot to nobody. But there are a lot of ways that Dungeons & Dragons is being used nowadays to help a lot of people. And even my Grammy, who is kind of, who I know, there were a lot of people back then that thought that the Satanic Panic had some credence to it. I've talked to a lot of people like that who are older and told them about some of these things, and they are really interested in a lot of these things that have come about in relation to Dungeons & Dragons that are good things. For instance, I know a lot of schools nowadays are using Dungeons & Dragons as a way to help kids with social anxieties and social issues, and even younger kids with just learning about the world and learning about moral consequences and stuff like that. Obviously, those Dungeons & Dragons games aren't focused on you're going to go into a goblin tribe and kill goblins. But it is Dungeons and Dragons being used to help kids understand moral consequences, understand interacting with other people, especially as part of a team. Which Dungeons and Dragons, by the way, doesn't have to involve a team. I prefer it with a team dynamic, but you can technically be a dungeon master for one player. Mm-hmm. It just involves a very different setup of story. But you were talking about something else that's really cool, which I knew about, but if you want to talk about it.
Also, D&D has been, I forget if it was like an academic study, but it's also been used in prisons as a good way to pass the time, and there are, like, I don't want to say there are studies because I don't remember the exact source, but people have stated in interviews that it has helped them deal with being in prison and helping them reform a little bit with these moral dilemmas, which Drew loves to make up in his own D&D stories.
Yeah, I do that all the time. It's a great way to study and involve yourself in moral dilemmas and stuff without actually putting yourself in that moral dilemma. I mean, I know that it is also being used in with juvie area.
Juvenile?
Juvenile detention centers for kids that are in juvenile detention centers to help with their moral. Sorry, I have a bit of cough right now. To help them better deal with moral